You are listening to Off the Shelf, a podcast by The Conference Board.
Hello, my name is John Metselaar. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a series which helps senior executives address challenges and stay informed about current issues ahead of market trends. And in this specific channel, we review books. It's brought to you by the Conference Board. And I'll be sitting down with Kara Goldin to discuss her latest book, Undaunted. She'll be telling her a very interesting life story in the process. And maybe as a little bit of introduction, it's an interesting story on how Kara and I met, or at least, so I think it's interesting. I saw a post by Kara on LinkedIn, and it was a young girl striding forward with a lot of pose, with a lot of purpose. And actually her title was What Walking with Purpose Looks Like. So it was on the weekend, and I decided to share the post to my boys, to my sons, to my two sons, as an inspiration for them. And you know what? Before I knew it, I had like several thousands of views and a bunch of likes as well. I was very happy very grateful to Kara to have inspired me and my audiences. So I reached out to her, I thanked her for it, and then we got in touch. I looked at her profile and I figured, hey, Kara's a bit of a celebrity. So I asked Kara, do you want to do a podcast with me? It would be fun to explore things like courage, purpose, obviously, passion, authenticity, vulnerability. And so here we are. We're talking to Kara in this podcast. Kara, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Fascinating life story you have. You call yourself an accidental entrepreneur, and that accidental entrepreneur, as it happened, found herself to be founder of Hint. I know you've told your life story, and you've frankly told it in your book as well. I'm sure our listeners want to hear your story from yourself. So why don't you go and introduce yourself and tell us a bit about how you got from the accidental entrepreneur into the founder of Hint.
Sure. Well, thank you for sharing a little bit more about my book, and also just for the kind introduction. And definitely excited to meet you on social media. So it's the good parts about social media, right? And
Exactly.
LinkedIn overall. But basically, I started my company Hint 17 years ago out of my own curiosity around diet sweeteners and what I had been drinking for years. And I had been drinking diet soda, Diet Coke in particular. And it came at a time when I was taking a couple of years off from my tech journey. So I had been the vice president of direct to consumer, was known as e-commerce partnerships for America Online almost since the beginning of America Online, but definitely the beginning of the shopping on America Online, and had successfully built with my team an incredible run of over $1 billion in revenue to AOL, and decided at that point to take a break. I had 3 young kids under the age of 4. I thought I was a little tired of the United Airlines pilots all knowing my name, and decided it's time to take a couple of months off. It ended up being a couple of years off, and I was really enjoying being a parent during that time. But I was also looking at what I was putting in my kids' bodies and sort of being the police a little bit about, wanting them to be very healthy and reading ingredients. And finally, I looked down one day at my diet soda and I could not believe what I had been drinking. And frankly, I felt like a bit of a hypocrite because I thought, here I am, telling my young kids, don't have this sugar, don't do this. And then I'd been drinking for years this diet soda, not really paying attention. And so I decided to switch from diet Coke to plain water for a couple of weeks just to see what would happen. And that's when lots of amazing things happened that frankly I felt had I had just accepted as part of life. So I had gained a bunch of weight through the course of all my pregnancies. I'd also developed really bad acne that I didn't even have as a teenager. And again, sort of assumed that that was just what my body and what my life was going to be. And so when I gave it up and started drinking plain water, that's when I lost 24 pounds in 2.5 weeks. My skin cleared up. And again, my curiosity kind of kicked into gear. I thought, what just happened? I mean, this is nuts that just by changing my diet drink that I thought was better for me, that it was, kind of for me, healthy perception versus healthy reality I had been marketed to. And here, suddenly I had just given up this small thing and this big change had occurred. That's when I thought, well, there's just one problem, and that is that water for me was really boring. After all, that's why I was drinking diet soda forever.
Yeah.
And I went into a local grocery store looking for a product similar to what I had basically made in my kitchen in order to get me to drink water, which was water with just slices of lemon or raspberries, whatever fruit I could find. I would throw it in a pitcher. And I was shocked at the amount of sugar and diet sweeteners in everything that sort of alluded to the fact of being healthier and better for you. So, in addition to the diet drinks, there was a drink called vitamin water that was probably the hottest thing on the shelf at the time. And I thought, I don't drink that, but I have plenty of friends who drink it. And when I asked them, if they ever read the ingredients, they said, no, because it says vitamins and that's healthy. And I thought, there is a huge industry out there that is not really protecting me or my family and not protecting consumers. So maybe I can just show people what I've seen by getting a product on the shelf. And again, hadn't been in beverages, hadn't really understood what I was about to go up against. But I thought, if nothing else, even if I fail, even if I can't get a product on the shelf, I could always go back to tech. If the worst case scenario was that I would be a really interesting dinner date, right? Where people would say, what have you been doing for the last couple of years besides having kids? And I could say, well, I launched a product. I had this really crazy idea and it didn't work. And so that was the beginnings of Hint.
Yeah, this gets me to one of the quotes which I love from your book, which is, what's the worst that can happen? I think your dad already told you that when you moved to New York the first time, right? When you were doubtful
Absolutely.
about doing this. And that's one of the things which I think we can, we can bring to our listeners.
Yeah. And I think that is, one of the things that I've really gone back to many times in my personal life and my professional life. If you get to a point where you get a little scared, right? And you're thinking, I don't know if it's going to work or not, but it rarely is as bad as you make it out to seem before you actually get started, right? You think, oh gosh, it's going to fail. I'm going to fail. I'm going to, something terrible is going to happen. Think back on all those times when you felt that way, and then you actually go through the situation. It more than likely, it either worked out better, or worked out not as bad as you had thought. Every single time in history, I've thought that. So I really encourage people to kind of stop themselves in their tracks and just go out and try instead of putting themselves through some sort of blockage.
Yeah, it's do or don't. There is no try, as Yoda said. Dive in, jump in, and ask yourself, what's the worst that can happen? And when you look at life in this way, it suddenly starts to look not maybe a lot easier, but somewhat easier, and
Absolutely.
helps you to take the plunge to discover totally new opportunities and a richer life. Now, you've always been very purposeful in your life. I got from your book, and let me give you a number: $472. What does it mean to you?
$472. Well, that was the number that I ended up uh, buying a plane ticket in order to go to multiple locations in order to look for my first job.
I found that to be so inspiring. How many people at that age invest in searching for the right opportunity? You had all the options. You didn't know what to do exactly, but you went to LA to go and meet. I think it was AB InBev, right, or Anheuser Busch.
Yes,
You
yes,
went. You moved on to Chicago because you're looking at McKinsey, but you found it too cold to Chicago. That wasn't worth the risk.
yep.
You went to Boston. In the end, you ended up in New York. And so I think that's just a beautiful illustration of investing in your future. Yeah, it's a lot of money, $472 when you are your age, at that age, right? But then when you step back, you look at the big picture. It shows that be thoughtful, but make sure you follow your passion.
Yeah, and it's I've told that story many times on college campuses and when I've been speaking at different universities. And it's interesting because I was waitressing, and there was a gentleman that had always come in to have dinner at this Mexican restaurant that I worked at in Phoenix. And uh, it's always this opportunity, I think, for people that so often people don't take advantage, especially when you're 20, 21 years old, when somebody asks you, well, what do you want to do? I mean, the standard response is, oh, I don't know, or I'm a journalism major, and I just thought, he's asking me a question, what I want to do. And I asked him what he did. Like, he was always in the Phoenix, Scottsdale area. I found out he was doing photo shoots and on movie sets for Anheuser-Busch product placement. And so I decided that I would just go on a tour, basically, um, before I even left to actually go interviewing, but ask anyone I knew who was older than me, what did they do? And what was their job? And why did they like it? Why didn't they like it? And could they actually get me an interview at their company? And it was amazing to me how many people actually wanted to help, and how many people I wasn't looking for any, you know, I didn't want to be, or I didn't think I could be the CEO of a company. I just wanted an entry level position. And it ends up that lots of people need entry level positions in their companies. So they were more than willing to recommend me because they saw something in me, a curiosity, the ability to ask questions, the ability to sort of do my research on companies and go back to people and follow up, all of those things that you want on your team. And so that led to a whole series of job interviews and ultimately offers along the way. And it was truly a fun month of travel for me, where I hadn't been to any of these cities, and ended up staying with a lot of parents of many of my college friends. And I always had enough money with me to buy a flower arrangement for them, or always would make my bed before leaving. All of those things I was always really aware of. But it's amazing how people really want to help if you ask.
You combined initiative with open-mindedness, and you said you're curious, right? I mean, that curiosity is, I think, I find so fundamental in life. I think you call yourself a learner as well. When you face a problem, you don't give up, but you dig in rather than run away from it. And so, I love this quote as well, which you put in your book somewhere. When you were facing a challenge, and people go like, "No, we cannot do this. We've never done this in the past." And you go like, "Well, what can we do?"
Absolutely. And I think, it's interesting growing up kind of in the tech industry, where I spent 7 years. I feel like that industry as a whole was one where there were so many people that I encountered who kept asking, how do we get there? Right? There was no roadmap. I mean, tech is constantly changing, and you're adding on to it as, you've got upgrades and version 2s, version 11s of the, iPhones as they go on. And so there there's always this desire by people to figure out what else can you do. When I got into the beverage industry, I found this enormous surge of people who instead were willing to accept or sort of push on the fact that they believed that nothing else could be done. And it was frustrating and foreign to me, frankly, to hear that coming from the tech industry where I felt like it was filled with possibilities every day. We just had to find them, and we had to connect and network with people in order to go and make those things happen. Look outside of industries, all of those things. So in some ways, I felt very frustrated, as I share in my book. There were definitely moments along the way, but I also felt like I could bring something to an industry that wasn't used to thinking this way if I just figured out a way to keep going.
Well, these paradigms, like people can get stuck in the old way of thinking so badly. The point on sweet drinks is such an illustration of it, right? I mean, well, everybody likes it. Well, yeah, maybe because there's nothing else available that's of any quality. And so, how do you break through that? And that's where your curiosity and your learning, your persistence has played out really nicely. It looks like.
Yeah, and I think part of it too, you look in any industry, and I guess today we call them visionary entrepreneurs. It's hard, it's frustrating, right? Especially to be the only one who's uh, thinking a certain way that there's a need for it. But I kept finding these, especially once I got it on the shelf, I kept finding these consumers who saw what I saw. I'll never forget that when I finally got hint on the shelf at Whole Foods, one of the things that we did, which was not common practice when I first launched, was to put an email on the bottle. Again, coming from tech, it was common to put a way for consumers to be able to reach out to you. So I put this email on the bottle, and I got an email from a gentleman who had just purchased Hint and was thrilled with the idea that it was an unsweetened flavored water that he really, really liked. And I think he probably thought that he was talking to a major customer service center. I was the only one in the company. And I asked if I could phone him and ask him a few more questions. And I said, "You seem like you've been searching for something like this for a while. May I ask why you're so interested in finding an unsweetened flavored water?" And he shared that he had a disease called type 2 diabetes. Now, this is 17 years ago, and it was such a small percentage of the population in the US and throughout the world. People just didn't know that much about it. I had never heard of type 2 diabetes, and that's when I asked him, a little bit more about it. And he said that he was a runner, he was very healthy. His doctor had actually said that he could have diet sweeteners, but what he found was every time he had some sort of diet sweetener in diet drinks, for example, his insulin levels would spike. So he was trying to avoid diet sweeteners, and yet he hated the taste of water. And I found it fascinating. And I went on to ask him other questions like, do you go to an endocrinologist? Are there people who are specialists in this? How do you find more people who are having this conversation? And when I got some more information from him, that's when I decided to pick up the phone and start phoning these different groups or showing up at different groups and offering samples. Because I thought if I can actually follow this consumer, even though I'm ahead of what the business and the industry is, then I can actually figure out whether or not there's something here, whether or not this is a viable business or not. Because the people who are the gatekeepers for me to be able to get on the shelf were saying, this isn't a business. No one wants unsweetened flavored water. Everyone wants sweet drinks. And I just really believed that people who wanted health, people who wanted to avoid diet sweeteners, they just didn't get it yet. like I had gotten it. And that didn't mean that there wasn't going to be a need for this product. And so that is, I think, consistent throughout many, many industries and stories of many visionary entrepreneurs. And I think more than anything, you have to find your consumer and do what your consumer is willing and looking for.
I think this story also illustrates your commitment or your belief. I guess it's more of you love figuring out people, right? What would make them happy and what they would value, and that ultimately, as you put in your book, you enjoyed their appreciation of what you had done for them. This story you just told us is a nice illustration of that point.
Thank
Building
you.
off of that, if I may, before we move into the book discussion, what is the most important single lesson you've learned from your accidental entrepreneur to founder of such an iconic brand? If you have to pick one, what is it?
One of the things that I think back on a lot, in even before my role at America Online, I worked my second job after working at Time Magazine. I worked at CNN. And this was back in the days when Ted Turner would still come into our office, and he was the first person I had ever seen wear cowboy boots and a suit. Even growing up where I grew up in Arizona, I never saw that before. But he was such a charismatic leader, and he also believed. He really believed that the world needed access to 24-hour news, that he felt like news by country didn't make any sense. And there were many days when we were not so sure. But the fact that a founder and CEO puts, I call them like spikes in the ground, and held them tight and said, this is what the world will look like in the future. I don't know when it's going to happen, but all I see is this trend going up. And if you have an idea, if you are leading a company, leading a group of people, that you have to be that person that is holding on to that idea and holding strong and not wavering. Because in order to get people to follow you, in order to get people, in order to lead in the right way, you can't do that unless you fundamentally believe. And I think like that's the biggest problem, is when you have a leader of a company, whether it's in a startup that they founded, or somebody who's just coming in and leading. If you don't believe in the product and the mission and the purpose, in the that this is actually helping consumers in some way, then you should not be there. And I think that that is such an important piece that I've learned from leaders like Ted Turner.
That's great. If I summarize that back to you, it's where purpose and passion meet vision, and are supported by commitment and persistence. Wow,
Yeah,
this sounds like a pretty good summary of what at least a big part of leadership is all about.
absolutely.
Thank you for all that inspiration when it came to your journey. We're going to take a little commercial break, and be back with you in just a few moments.
Looking for additional business insights in this subject area and beyond this podcast? Go to tcb.org and explore our Human Capital Centre. Uncover a large array of products hosted by the Conference Board in focus areas like diversity and inclusion, talent management, and many others. Products include peer-to-peer networking events, expert briefings, publications, data and analysis, webcasts, videos, and blogs.
And we're back for the second part with Kara Goldin, where we're going to go and focus more on her book, Undaunted. Kara, how did you? You have a large family, 4 children. You did your entrepreneurial work. You managed Hint. and then you decide to, why not write a book on top? How did you where did you find the time? How did you decide to write it, and also why?
So it's a funny story. I call myself an accidental entrepreneur, but I'm an accidental author as well. It was years of actually journaling that ultimately became a book. And it's funny, when I was launching Hint, the key thing that I found that really helped to get the word out about the product was actually sharing my story of why I founded Hint. People would reach out to me who knew that I was a tech executive, and they thought it was just crazy that I went from, a successful role, one of the youngest vice presidents at America Online, one of the few females at that level, and I just got off the train and went and started a beverage company. I mean, it was just crazy. So people wanted to know the backstory, like, why did you do that? What was the reason? Why, uh, you know, did tech treat you terribly? Did, all of these different stories. And so I started sharing the story around, why I did this more than anything. And I found that when I would be asked to speak at many of these conferences as well, there would always be this Q&A at the end, and people would ask a question, but also follow it up with a little bit more about themselves. Like, you must be a fearless risk taker. You must be, um, you must not be worried about failing. All of these different things along the way. And I found that the easiest way to answer people's questions, rather than saying a quick no or sure I am, I don't have any fears at all, was to actually share a story, because that would make it that much more relatable to how I actually did have fears and how, I was afraid of risk, but I figured out ways to actually get through those things. And after 6 years, one day I was looking down at my journal and it was 600 pages. And I started to think that there are a lot of people who don't go to conferences or aren't invited to speak inside companies that I'm speaking at. And maybe they could really benefit. Maybe there's people who think about starting ideas and they don't do them because they think all the same things that the people who are asking me questions think. And so I asked a friend of mine who has published multiple books. I said, how do you think what's the best way to actually bind my journal and get it out there so that I can let more people know about how I feel about these things and my own journey? And she said, you mean write a book? And I said, oh no, I'm way too busy. I mean, how could I write a book? I mean, that's daunting. And then I thought, I think the key thing that I need is really an editor who can take it down to a digestible amount of words and be able to take a lot of these lessons out of the book. So that really that took about a year and a half, and got it into a place that we really were happy with. I think I'll say one more thing, that probably the most exciting thing about launching the book, I was excited to just kind of get the story out there and kept thinking about it for existing entrepreneurs and people who, maybe students that thought maybe they wanted to go be an entrepreneur. But I've had so many people, especially over the last, year and a half since the book came out, who have been successful executives who have never launched their own thing, never launched their own idea, who have reached out to me and said, I read your book. I mean, these are people who are running major public companies that you can't believe it, that they're excited to launch their own idea. But this book has inspired so many people to just go out and try. And it's okay to fail. All of those things. So that is probably the most exciting thing for me about this book that I didn't expect.
That's terrific. I do a bit of teaching, a lot of teaching actually, and as I always finish my courses by a special module which I call "Innovate You,"
Hmm.
and many of the
Totally.
concept that you're talking about. This is also why I reached out to you. I'm very passionate about, and I see the resonance with people, frankly, of all ages. I teach undergrads on this subject, but even executive MBA students that are 30 to 40 to even 50 years old. Yeah, they are stuck in their realities, and they indeed have so many fears. Now, you strike me as when I read the book. Your attitude to life, being curious, being a learner, showing initiative, you actually struck me as somebody who didn't have too many fears. So, what were your fears? Which ones did you have to overcome when you were much younger, I guess?
Well, one of the fears that I share a story in the book is about this is the fear of heights. So I remember having a fear of heights since I was a very young girl, and I grew up in Arizona. I remember the first time I really figured out that I was very afraid of heights was when I went to the Grand Canyon, and went with my parents, and we drove on the canyon. I remember I couldn't wait to actually get out of there because I kept looking out the car window thinking, what if I fall? And that would be terrible. And even though we were in a car, everything was fine. But I thought every time I have that fear, then I almost get paralyzed by it, right? Like it's a very uncomfortable feeling that I can't move forward in some way. And so I decided that I would go and hike the canyon and try and overcome that fear, which took a lot of training. I had to, kind of mentally train as well as physically train. And what I realized on that journey is that there were things that I could do ahead of time to plan. So I started the hike at 4 o'clock in the morning, so I couldn't actually see the bottom of the canyon because it was so dark out. I just had my headlamp on and I was with some other people. But along the way, lots of things happened. I ran into a herd of goats that nearly killed me, that jumped over my head with my sister and I. And but it didn't. Didn't it didn't actually happen. And then, ran into a rattlesnake. All of the lessons that I had learned ahead of time about backing up, that rattlesnakes can only jump 15 feet, I think it is. And I thought if I'm back 20, they're not going to be able to get me. All of these lessons along the way, eventually it never was that bad, right? And so I figured out how to move forward and got through those hurdles. And what I realized when I finally got out of the canyon is that all of that day, although it was incredible, and 12 hours later, 22 miles later, it was it was hard. I was exhausted, but I should be proud of the things that I was able to accomplish along the way. And no one can take those things away from you. And the thing that I realized more than anything is when you actually go out and you face your fears, when you do things that you don't think you can accomplish, and you do ultimately go and get those things accomplished, that is something to actually put in your pocket, right? That you can actually go out and do harder and harder things. So every year, I now go out and challenge myself. I'm not afraid to take on a challenge. That doesn't mean that I don't get a little nervous about it. That doesn't mean that I don't plan for it. But I think the more of these challenges that you take on, uh, the better leader you are, the more human you are, because you understand how other people feel about things. But the people that don't ever take on challenges, those aren't generally the most interesting people, right? They're not the people that are probably the most relatable. They don't have as many stories along the way.
Playing it
And
safe.
right, and they play it safe. And I think that the other piece of it is that they they don't know how strong they really are and what they're really capable of. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to get to the end of my life thinking that I didn't do things in my life that I didn't think that I could. And I think also as a parent too, I think that the more stories you have like this of things that you did, starting a beverage company in a very crowded industry, taking on Big Sugar, trying to clean up water in drinking fountains across America, things like this that a lot of people were more than willing to say, that's you can't be doing that. That's too hard. It'll never happen. You don't have the right experience. You know, this is going to be a bust. Whatever they said along the way, and then today, those same people, the doubters, as I call them, are the ones that are kind of laughing at themselves, and look at this example as one that maybe they didn't think was going to happen, but it's successfully grown into a place where I think many people sort of question their own
I
doubt.
always I always say life is so much more exciting outside your comfort zone. So stretch. You don't need to stretch, but you need to stretch yourself all the time, and that gets you out. The way you summarize your life, or at least the significant achievements in your life, interventions in your life, is this is the ikigai concept, right? It's living a
Hmm.
meaningful life, living a life well lived. My I always say, how often do you meet people? You go like, how was your week? Well, same old. It's like, seriously, how can you stay in a job when you say that? My wife came back from a friend, the other, was it last week? She said, she gave the example of, the wife asked the man at the dinner table, how was your day? Well, you asked it yesterday. Just to illustrate that every day is the same, and that's not conducive, I think, for a life well lived, a meaningful life.
Yeah. And I think also just finding something, I also encourage people to really find things that you're passionate about too. I think that that's the other thing that so many people don't take the opportunity to do. I mean, people have said, how do you find your mission? How do you find something that you're really interested in? I think that, you start small. I mean, it could be a hobby. It could be something that just really gets you up in the morning that you're really curious about, that you're thinking about. And that's how big ideas end up getting created. Um, you know, Spackle for walls ended up getting created that way, right? All these different inventors that are out there in the world that have thought up things are people that were curious, and it wasn't a popular idea. That's where new ideas end up coming from, the crazy ones, as Steve Jobs used to say, right?
Yeah,
Pay
yes,
attention to those people.
it's the crazy ones that change the world. So now you mentioned curiosity again, and I really must reinforce, or I want to I want to reinforce that, because that's really also, you've expressed that in your learning, passion, right? I mean, I think you mentioned leaders are readers, or at least that's my take on what
Yeah,
you said. Are you still reading as much?
I'm reading a lot. I also listen to audiobooks as well, having published my own book and done an audio version of the book. I became very, very interested in more and more audiobooks because I find that I still love a paper book, though. I mean, I still love carrying it and going back to certain chapters as well. Um, but I really find that for me, founder stories and people who have really done things that they had their own doubters along the way, and their stories of where it almost failed, but they were able to figure out ways to keep it moving and keep it going. So that for me is probably the most interesting. Also, people who are really interested in uh, categories and how new categories are created. Because as I share with entrepreneurs, who are, really convinced that they've got the next big idea, and they don't want to share it with people because no one else is doing it. Oftentimes, when you're developing a new product or a new company that sort of fits into that description, you're actually creating an entirely new category. And the challenge with new categories is that when no one else is doing it, when you don't have competition, then you actually have to educate the consumer. And educating the consumer takes time, often takes money. It takes persistence, again, going
Patience.
back, patience. So all of those things. And so I think just trying to really dissect exactly what it takes. It's not just about developing a company. It really is developing an entirely new category, which is what I did accidentally when I was developing Hint. And, so many lessons along the way in that chapter. I mean, I remember thinking that as soon as one of the big guys, Pepsi or Coke, came out with a product, we were done, right? That's what so many people told me, right? All the people who I thought had experience and really knew what was going on. Many people who we were looking to invest in the company, they wouldn't invest because they basically thought that we would be roadkill as soon as one of the big guys came out with a competitive product. And what I realized is that when competition comes along, you can only do what you can control, right? I can't control if Coke or Pepsi is going to develop a new product in my category. And what it did actually was sort of counter to what I thought would have happened, which was that it expanded the category, it validated the category. And so what I had to do was actually just continue to be the best quality, have go on to continue distribution. Even when certain distribution was blocked from me, I just figured out other ways to continue to grow. And that's hard. It's not easy, but I think more than anything in a startup, the other thing that I've learned is staying alive is half the battle, right? If you can actually fund your company enough and have enough people supporting you along the way, challenges are going to happen, failures are going to happen, things that you didn't expect are going to happen along the way, but you have to just keep growing. And the number of companies that I've seen over the last 17 years that I probably feared a little bit, that I thought, oh, they're really onto something, I'm in trouble now, they went out of business. I mean, there's a laundry list of those companies. And again, it's really, really tough for you as a founder to kind of keep your head on straight about that until you've actually weathered the storms. Now it's easy for me to look back and see what I've seen, but it's when you're in it, it's much more difficult.
Kara, I can talk to you for the next hour probably, and we're running late, we're running long on this podcast already, but I think it's worth it. So many interesting and valuable concepts. I want to close with this notion of fear, or as you called it, doubt or doubters.
Mm-hmm.
I always say courage is persisting in the face of being terrified. I think accepting that we all have our fears, but go and, as you said, confront them and break through them is just so powerful, so challenging, but also so powerful, and can lead to such a more fulfilling life. Maybe just to close out, and what is your final message for those doubts and doubters, and those people that are struggling with their fears? What can you tell them to get them to a more fulfilling life?
Yeah, I think everyone has fears. And I think that the key thing that we think when we are fearful is that we're unique, right? That we are afraid and we don't. This is something that the most successful, the most powerful people don't feel, uh, but they do. And I really believe that everyone has fears. The key thing that they've figured out is how do you push through? And I'm a huge believer that complacency will kill you, right? If you really believe that in a concept, in your mission, you have to figure out how do you keep moving forward. And And even if that's baby steps and making some progress, and if you look at it that way versus actually thinking about, the actual fear, how do I keep moving forward? That's the thing really to focus on. And eventually I think it works out a lot better than you ever thought that it would.
Beautiful summary. Kara Goldin, thank you so very much for having joined the Conference Boards podcast. It's been a true pleasure to have talked to you. And I wish you all the very best in your next adventures in life. With all this already in the pocket, who knows where this will go.
Thank you.
And I hope to stay in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Okay, audience, thank you for listening. I hope you found this podcast insightful. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our Off the Shelf podcast series, or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcast. Thanks, Kara. Thank you all very much. Until next time.
This has been Off the Shelf, a podcast by the Conference Board.